Thanks. Turn me down, hot mic. Hey, it's good to be back with you. Here. Okay, thanks. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for being a Happy New Year. One person it's a Happy New Year.
Let's go.
Okay, good. Nick will lead us out on that. How many of y'all have set New Year's resolutions? Okay. How many of y'all I have ideas, but I don't want to commit, so I don't have to try to make them or not? Okay, good. Okay, yeah. How many of y'all halfway through the year look at what you did accomplish and then just count that as your New Year's resolution? That's a good strategy. So about this summer, at the end of the semester, just look back and see what you did well and say, you know what? I put it on there. I accomplished it. Yeah, I do lists like that. I may not get to the things on my list, but I definitely will add things to it so I can check it off and feel accomplished. So, looking at New Year's resolutions, the top 10 New Year's resolutions for 2025, you can probably guess a lot of them. What do you think's number one? Exercise more. Number 2 is lose weight. 3, get organized. How many of y'all need to put that on your list? Learn a new skill or hobby. Live life to the fullest. That one surprised me. Just live life. I like the ambiguity of it. Sorry, Hannah. Told her I wouldn't use huge words. Save money. Save more money. Spend less money. Quit smoking. Apparently we have a lot of smokers. Spend more time with family and friends. Travel more. And here's one you should put on your list so that way you can mark it off. Read more. See, just put that on your list. And all those textbooks right there, checked it off. You read more. So, New Year's resolutions. What are your goals for this year? Who are you going to be at the end of this year? What are you called to do? That's what we're going to look at today in Genesis 1, the first chapter. Let's start from the beginning. Our calling and our identity. In Genesis 1, starting in verse 26. So God has made creation, and he's getting towards the end of this beautiful, creative story in his work. So we get to see God at work and see what our work is. In verse 26, then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all creatures that move along the ground." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the air, and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything has the breath of life in it. I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. So from the very beginning, it says that God made us in his image. Over and over, it talks about this image of God that we are created to bear. We are image bearers. We are made in the image of God and created by him. So this is our identity. So if you're wondering, who are you? You are God's. And you're created to be like him. We live in a pandemic of comparison. Do you feel it? You're in college, right? There's so many areas of your life that you are built, that you are created to compare, right? Just in your everyday life, you have social media, right? Everything built into social media is comparison. Did I get enough likes? Do people like me? Do they like that other person more? Does that person's clothes look awesome? What is that person doing with their hair? What is that person doing with their life? I met one time at a restaurant this little girl, full of personality, and she was probably 5, maybe 6, and she was in the booth behind us, and we started talking to her because she was ready. She was one of those kids that like leans over your booth and is like in the middle of your conversation. And she, in the middle of the conversation, gave us all of her social media handles to go follow. And she said, my goal is to be an influencer. I was like, honey, you're 6 years old. Who are you influencing? But that was her goal. Can you imagine being 6 and every day waking up to see how many people are following you? To see every day, do they like me? To be 6 years old and your biggest goal is to worry about what other people think. But we are made in God's image. There's a book called The Anxious Generation. It's very good. But it talks about your generation grew up with a phone in your hand in every day in comparison. And there are good things about social media, that maybe you found your way to the BSM, or you met your roommate because you saw that you were both going to U of H, and there are very difficult challenges. It's created this heightened anxiety, this heightened depression, because you grew up in a world in constant comparison and not being able to switch that off. If our mark is somebody else who has their flaws, that has their inconsistencies, we are always going to be comparing, and we can adjust our comparison. And it creates this environment of tearing down. Because if this person is awesome and I tear them down, then they're lower and I can be raised up. We don't see that at all in our world. Right? This comparison creates this environment where we're always wondering if we're good enough. But here at the very beginning, before sin entered into the world, God said, you are good enough. And what had Adam and Eve done at that point? Not a single thing. Think about it. They weren't good farmers. They weren't good hunters. They hadn't built a house. They had done nothing. But they were made in the image of God. And God looked at them and said, you are not just good. You are very good. Maybe some of us need to get a marker and put on your mirror, very good, to remind you of who you really are. See, the struggle that we have is everything's constantly changing, and we're wondering where we fit into that. And if our comparison is other people, we'll never find an ending place and never have a place of rest. But he says, you are good. You're good enough because I made you. And God's character, he says, you're in my image, right? When we think about the image of God, maybe you have Rembrandt's pictures of what God looks like in your head. Maybe you have from your story Bible of what God looked like. But we don't know what God looked like. We know his character. So we're made in his character. And that's very good. So for us to think about, what is my character? What has God placed in me that looks like him? And that he is consistent. He doesn't change. He was the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So we can compare ourselves to him because he's unchanging. And here's the thing. He made us in his image. It's not that we're not good enough. We fail in remembering who we are. That we are his. We have to work to remember, not work hard to be. So that we remember that we are made in his image. And then he says, he gives a command to them. He says to be fruitful and multiply. And usually we think of that in the forms of get married, have children, ta-da, that's your purpose. But if that was the only thing that God had as a purpose for humanity, then Jesus failed. Paul failed. Giants of the faith failed, who weren't married, who didn't have kids. That is not the only purpose that God made humanity. He said to be fruitful, to bear fruit. Anybody grown a fruit tree? Have one in your yard? Yeah. Does a fruit tree produce fruit so it can eat? No, the purpose of a fruit tree is to grow fruit to give. He says, be fruitful. What are you giving into the world? What are you bearing? I had a tree when I lived in Levelland, and if you know anything about the panhandle of Texas, they will tell you every tree was brought there because there used to be no trees in the panhandle. And every tree was brought there. And I moved into this house, and there was this tree, and it had something that was falling from a few of its branches, but I couldn't tell what it was. And I love to garden. And I was in this house for 4 years, and I tried so hard. I thought, you know what, we're in a drought. When we get out of the drought, then this tree is going to blossom, and then it's going to bear fruit, and it's going to be wonderful. We got out of the drought. It bore like 2 more fruit, but they were bad too. Every year, year after year, it wouldn't bear good fruit. Was it being fruitful? I guess, but not really. It wasn't bearing the thing that it was supposed to do. And somebody told me who knew something about plants was like, we need to dig down and fertilize this tree so it can bear fruit. It's lacking in nourishment. See, I wonder sometimes in our own life if we're bearing this fruit, but nobody can even tell what it is because we're lacking nourishment. We're lacking the deep down, root-soaking nourishment that will give life and bear fruit. The thing about fruit is that it gives nourishment to others. So I want you to think about your life. If your life this year is to Know that you're made in the image of God, to bear that image, and then to bear fruit. Where are the places that you are being fruitful? And see, when we think about fruitfulness in our life, then we can think about not just, are we in a relationship? Is this moving towards marriage? Are we having children in the future? But I'm here at school. I'm sitting in this class. What fruit is this class bearing? Am I learning something that's for when I get into my career that I'll be able to use? See, you're growing. See, the plant, the tree, doesn't go from like winter to like, boom, there's a fruit there, right? There's a process. It gains nourishment. It grows leaves. It makes flowers. It pollinates, and then it bears fruit. There's a process. It says, maybe this meantime is preparing you for the fruit that you will produce later in the places that God has called you. What about in your work? Some of you have jobs. How are you bearing fruit there? It says to fill the earth, right? And we think of that in the forms of children, but to fill something is that there is a void and your life fills that. To think about in your life, where has God placed you to bring a filling of a void in that space? Maybe he's placed you in that certain seat in class because that person beside you has a void in their life that needs Jesus, and you can fill it. Maybe he's placed you in your work because there's somebody who needs encouragement in their faith, or needs to be, they don't know any other believer, or they've had maybe this bad experience, and you get to bear witness to who Jesus is. Or maybe he's given you the void of a whole summer, or a portion of a summer, and he said, would you fill it with your life and go and serve? Serve on missions, serve at a camp, serve at a church. So he says, fill this space, this void. Be fruitful. And then he says, I'm not going to move on. So in this filling, I listened to a podcast, and I was so intrigued that it stuck with me last year. And there were two med students, and they talked about their life in med school. And when they entered into med school, the professors at orientation said, it's nice knowing you. For the next 4 years, you are going to give 60 to 80 hours a week to this. That is 2 full-time jobs that you're going to give to med school. But also, one of these students had heard before he went to med school about a student who had a Sabbath. And he thought, how can I have a Sabbath and work 60 to 80 hours a week? He says, what if it's about my management of time? What has God given me? And so he started to look at his schedule, and he said, okay, if I have a Sabbath, I'm going to take Sundays out. Now I have 6 days in the week. And they said that I would give 60 to 80 hours to this. So six days, 60 hours, that looks good. So what if I gave 10 hours a day to med school? And in that 10 hours, I was studying, I was in class, I was giving everything to med school. And he said, and then what if I gave 8 hours to sleeping? Who would love 8 hours a night of sleeping? I would. So he gave 8 hours to sleeping. So he said, so that's 18 hours of my 24 hours that are taken up. And then he says, and then what if I had 1 hour that I could give to the Lord for my personal growth and spiritual growth? He says, I would still have 5 hours a day to do whatever I wanted. How many of y'all look at your schedule and think, 5 hours? I would like 1 hour in my day to do whatever I wanted. But every day for 4 years, this student had 5 hours a day to read a book. He said, he and his like really close friend, they said, we probably were the only 2 people in med school who read books that weren't medical books. He said, we had hobbies. We would watch movies. Nobody in med school, anybody else was doing that. But we orchestrated our time. He said, now there's things that I had to give up. So I deleted my social media because I knew I couldn't handle having social media and giving 10 hours to study, because I would default to go look. He said, but what happened? What happened in that time where everybody else was grinding out 15 hours of studying and had no life for anything else, and working on Sundays, doing the same thing and giving up church and giving up community so they could be the best doctor? He said, what I found was giving my brain rest and giving my brain the ability to do something fun and creative and read stories, that it was more refreshed when it came time to study. So I actually only needed 10 hours. But that takes deep trust in the Lord. It's why when God sends Israel out God has Israel out in the wilderness, and he only gives them manna for that day. Why? Because they have to trust the next day that there will be enough. We live in a scarcity world, and God says, I have abundance, but I need you to trust me. So I want you to think about, maybe take out your phone for a second, or a piece of paper, however you like to work. Think about, how many hours are you in class a day or studying? How many hours are you at work, for those of you who work? How many hours do you typically sleep a day? Okay, how many hours are you in church? Maybe outside of Sunday. Because some of y'all have Bible studies and this worship. And then how many hours do you give to personal devotions to God? Maybe that's your quiet time or worship that you do personally. And add that up. And times it by 6. Because that's for each day, right? Just kind of on average. Is it more than 144 hours? To think about, how do we use our time? What does fruitfulness really look like? If he's called us to be fruitful, he didn't call us to be busy. I like to be busy. I'm an achiever, if you don't know me. I like to achieve things. That is why I put things on the list that I've already done so I can mark them off so I can feel good that something got done so I could achieve it. There was research that was done on employees who did mastery experiences. So they learned a new skill. Learning something new in your leisure time. And the meta-analysis, or the kind of gathering of all the information, involved over 26,000 employees. And it confirmed that employees who learned new things, who gave their time to leisure and their free time, they were more energized and less tired in a week. Think about that. People who had free time and did something that they enjoyed actually worked better. Research also found that time with family and enjoying passions contributed to a better work ability and willingness to work with others. See, we're created for community. We're created to create the image of God. In the middle of creating, he said, I'm going to make people and put a little bit of me in them. And this little bit of me has creativity. He says, use it. So do we trust God with our time? Do we trust him that there is enough? Or do we waste our time? Think about the things in your life that you spend time with. Do they bear fruit? And maybe there's some fruit. Maybe they're like my little tree that I assume was a peach tree because I never could figure out because it never really looked like anything. It wasn't useful. Do the things in our life, do they bear good fruit? And then he says to multiply. Now, Jesus in the New Testament redefines this, right? He talks about a farmer who throws seed on the ground, and he says the seed on the good soil did what? It grew 30, 60, 100 times. Y'all, a farmer would appreciate if the seed that it put in the ground, that he put in, or she put in the ground, would just bear one time what it's worth. 30, 60. God's multiplication is outrageous when we're doing the things that he's called us to. He says there's going to be plenty. And then in Matthew 28, he tells us to, as we are going, so right, as we are going to do what? Anybody know? As we are going to make disciples. Yes. So we often just say, go and make disciples, but the literal translation is, as you are going, make disciples. Be fruitful, multiply. He's redefining the mandate of Genesis 1. So to think about in this year, my challenge to you is to think about, how are you living this out? How are you remembering and believing that you are made in God's image? You are enough. And then how are you being fruitful? What is bearing fruit in your life? He created you with purpose. He created you and put you in places for you to bear good fruit. And when you're living in that, he says, I can multiply it 30, 60, 100 times. You can't even imagine. And then how are we making disciples? How is being in your class, going to the gym, being at work, being a family member, being in traffic? I always think, and I drive a lot, and Kayla has testified to my commute this week. There are lots of opportunities to bear witness to something on that road. But in little ways, can I even bless somebody? Can I slow a little bit down and let them in? Can I not get angry and just pretend like their mother is lying on the ground and needing medical attention, and that's why they're driving like that to get home? I don't know their life. I don't know what hard day that they've had at work. I don't know what argument that they had with their kid before they got on the road. Can I believe the best about them? I have a whole hour to believe a lot of things about a lot of people on the road. but can I also be a blessing to them? So that one car that was having a hard day, but somebody let them in. Or didn't, yell at them or honk my very sad little horn. It's not very strong. If I ever honk at you, it's like beep. But yeah, how do we bear fruit in the world? And so my challenge is, whether you made a resolution or not, what fruit are you going to bear this year? What emptiness in the world that God has placed you in the middle of and said, fill it up with all that I am, that I have filled you up with? Who are the people that God has placed you around so that you can share how good our Jesus is? And will you do it? So we have a couple of questions. I'm going to have Aaron come and break us into groups.
Leaders, stand up. We also have new leaders in the room, as it's a new semester, so you might see some new faces.